Most people think prayer is about speaking to God. Ibn Arabi reveals something far deeper. True prayer begins when you stop speaking and allow God to speak through you. If your words have not changed your heart, then perhaps you have been talking about God, not to God. Ibn Arabi teaches that God is not distant, not hidden behind the skies, and not reached by loud voices or poetic words. God is nearer to you than your own breath, but the tragedy of the seeker is that he speaks too much and listens to little. The correct way to talk to God does not begin with the tongue. It begins with presence. When a person says, "O God," while his heart is absent, Ibn Arabi says this is not supplication, it is habit. Real prayer is not a request, it is a state. It is the moment when the ego steps aside and the servant stands empty, allowing divine meaning to descend. God does not need to be informed of your needs. He already knows them before they arise within you. According to Ibn Arabi, every soul has its own unique language with God. Some speak through silence, some through tears, some through service, and some through remembrance. The mistake is imitation, using borrowed words without an awakened heart. God listens not to sentences, but to sincerity. A broken whisper from the heart is louder in the unseen world than 1,000 memorized prayers. Ibn Arabi reveals a profound secret. When you speak to God correctly, you are not the speaker. The divine speaks to himself through you. This is why true prayer transforms the one who prays. If your prayer leaves you the same, then it was conversation with yourself, not communion with God. He explains that God answers before you ask, but the answer appears only when your inner vision is refined. Often people say, God does not respond. Yet Ibn Arabi says the response is constant. What is missing is the ability to recognize it. The heart covered by ego, fear, and expectation cannot hear the subtle reply of the divine. The correct way to talk to God, Ibn Arabi says, is to approach without demands. When prayer becomes a transaction, it loses its light, but when prayer becomes intimacy, it opens doors unseen. Speak to God as one who knows he owns nothing, deserves nothing, and yet is infinitely loved. In the highest station, Ibn Arabi teaches, prayer dissolves completely. There is no I calling and no you answering. There is only presence witnessing presence. This is the prayer of the realized ones, where silence itself becomes worship, and existence bows without words. So if you wish to speak to God correctly, purify your intention, quiet your ego, and let your heart become a mirror. When the mirror is clean, God does not need words to appear. True prayer, as understood through the vision of Ibn Arabi, does not begin when the lips move, but when the inner noise comes to rest. Most people assume that speaking to God requires carefully chosen words, eloquent phrases, or inherited formulas. Yet Ibn Arabi invites the seeker to a far subtler reality. Words belong to the world of forms, but God is known beyond form. If the heart is distracted, restless, or filled with self-awareness, then even the most beautiful prayer remains veiled. Presence is the foundation of all real communion, and without it, speech becomes a curtain rather than a bridge. Ibn Arabi teaches that the heart is the true organ of dialogue with the divine. When the heart is absent, the tongue merely performs an action, repeating sounds learned from others. Such prayer may comfort the ego, but that does not awaken the soul. Presence means that the servant stands fully aware before God, stripped of performance, expectation, and self-display. In that moment, prayer is no longer an activity, it becomes a state of being. The seeker does not approach God as one who knows, but as one who is ready to be known. Silence plays a central role in this understanding. Ibn Arabi does not view silence as emptiness, but as receptivity. Just as the night sky reveals stars only when it grows dark, the heart reveals divine meaning only when it grows quiet. Silence is not the absence of prayer, it is its most refined form. When the inner dialogue stops, the divine address begins. This is why many realized souls speak little in prayer, yet emerge transformed, while others speak endlessly and remain unchanged. Sincerity, in Ibn Arabi's vision, is the soul's nakedness before God. To be sincere is to abandon masks, roles, and spiritual ambition. God does not seek polished devotion. He seeks truthfulness of state. A prayer filled with weakness, confusion, and even doubt can be more real than a prayer filled with confidence and certainty. If it arises from an honest heart, presence demands courage, because it requires the servant to face himself without distraction, and to stand before God without bargaining. Ibn Arabi also emphasizes that presence cannot be forced. It is not produced by effort alone, nor achieved by technique. It is a gift that descends when the servant becomes inwardly aligned. This alignment comes through remembrance, humility, and patience with one's own limitations. When prayer becomes an attempt to control outcomes, presence fades, but when prayer becomes an offering of oneself, presence naturally unfolds. In that unfolding, the heart becomes attentive, not to its own voice, but to the subtle movement of divine nearness. The absence of presence, Ibn Arabi explains, is the reason many feel unheard in prayer. They ask, yet do not feel answered, because they are listening with the same ego that is speaking. Presence changes the direction of prayer. Instead of projecting desires outward, the heart turns inward and upward at once. In this turning, prayer stops being a request and becomes recognition. The servant realizes that God was already present before the prayer began, closer than the thought that prompted it. In the state of true presence, the distinction between speaking and listening begins to blur. The servant may still use words, but the words arise from a deeper stillness. They are no longer chosen, they are given. Ibn Arabi suggests that in such moments, prayer is not authored by the self, it flows through the self. This is why certain prayers carry weight, not because of their language, but because of the state from which they emerge. Ultimately, Ibn Arabi's teaching points to a radical shift in how prayer is understood. To talk to God correctly is not to perfect one's speech, but to perfect one's attentiveness. Presence is the doorway through which all genuine prayer passes, and silence is the key that opens it. When the heart stands fully awake before God, even a single breath can become supplication. Even a tear can become remembrance. And even stillness itself becomes a form of dialogue where the servant realizes that what he sought to say was already known, and what he longed to hear was already being spoken within him. Ibn Arabi invites the seeker to reconsider the meaning of divine response by overturning the common assumption that God answers only after being asked. In his vision, the response precedes the request because God's knowledge encompasses the servant before intention, before language, and even before awareness itself. What humans interpret as silence is rarely absence. It is more often a mismatch between the subtlety of the answer and the coarseness of perception. The divine reply does not always arrive in words or events that align with expectation, but in movements of meaning that require an awakened inner sense to recognize. According to Ibn Arabi, the heart is the place where divine communication is received, but not every heart is prepared to hear. When the heart is dominated by urgency, fear, or desire, it filters reality through personal need. In such a state, the servant listens only for confirmation of what he wants, not for what is being given. God's response may arrive as a delay, a redirection, or even a closing of a door, yet the ego labels this as rejection. Ibn Arabi teaches that the divine answer is always appropriate to the soul's true need, not to its immediate demand. The inability to recognize God's response stems from attachment to form. People expect answers to appear in specific shapes, a fulfilled wish, a visible miracle, or an external sign. But Ibn Arabi emphasizes that God often responds by changing the one who asks, not the situation being asked about. A softened heart, a sudden clarity, a loss of desire, or a new patience may be the response itself. When the servant remains focused on outcomes, these inner transformations go unnoticed, and the prayer is declared unanswered. Ibn Arabi also explains that divine silence is a form of speech. Silence teaches endurance. trust, and surrender. It stretches the soul beyond its habitual limits and purifies intention. When an answer is delayed, it is often because the servant is not yet capable of receiving it without harm. The divine response waits until the heart is wide enough to hold it. What appears as absence is, in reality, careful timing rooted in mercy rather than neglect. Expectation is another veil that blocks recognition. When the servant approaches prayer with a fixed image of how God should respond, he limits the infinite ways in which response can occur. Ibn Arabi warns that such certainty about outcomes is a subtle form of ego, disguising itself as faith. True faith, in his view, leaves space for surprise. It trusts that whatever unfolds carries divine wisdom, even when that wisdom contradicts personal desire. The seeker's perception matures through repeated encounters with unanswered prayers. Over time, Ibn Arabi says, the heart begins to notice patterns. What was once asked for and denied later reveals itself as protection. What was delayed later appears as preparation. In this unfolding, the servant realizes that God was responding all along, but in a language that could only be understood after transformation.